A group of Australians unable to return home because of the federal government's strict arrivals cap have filed legal action against Australia with the UN. Almost 500,000 Australians have returned home since the beginning of the pandemic, but there are still more than 36,000 people stranded overseas wanting to come home. Now legal action has been lodged with the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva over claims that Australians are being arbitrarily banned from entering their own country. Human rights lawyer Jeffrey Robertson is advising the Australians. He joins us from London. Jeffrey, welcome back to Breakfast.
Good morning, Fran.
What's this
from lockdown London?
Yes, from lockdown London. I'm sorry about that. What's this complaint lodged against Australia in the UN? What's at the heart of it?
Well, international law has always regarded the right to return home as a fundamental right, partly for psychological reasons. We have an affinity with the land of our birth, with the country, with its people. We may go on and become expatriates, but we're not expatriates. And so there is really in the international covenant, which Malcolm Fraser signed up to actually in 1980, there is a provision which is quite absolute that you can't be arbitrarily stopped from returning home. And the UN Human Rights Committee is a committee of 18 experts, a tribunal in Geneva. And of course, it's been useful in past. You remember Tasmania had to change its laws that criminalised gay sex when a decision was made. So I think there are so many frustrated Australians who can't get home, who need to get home because of their elderly relatives, because of they've got jobs to go to. And so a group of them, 3 applicants, I'm taking to the Human Rights Committee. One's a microbiologist, one's a chemist, and the other's a volcanologist. And they've all been vaccinated. They're all prepared to do quarantine for 14 days, and they're even prepared to pay for it. But over the last year, they've found it impossible to get home. DFAT, I guess, does its best. It emails all 35,000 from time to time saying there's a flight leaving from Singapore in 24 hours, which isn't much good if you've got your family in San Francisco.
Yeah. How many Australians, I mean, you're taking 3 to the court, how many are represented in this group, which is called strandedaussies.org?
I think it's quite large. I don't know. It's a federal government responsibility, and DFAT says that 35,000 want to get home and can't, and 5,000 of those are vulnerable in some way. So that's the situation. And any decent country would, fellow citizens, after all, would try to help them. But they don't sense that there is any real determination from the government.
Are there competing laws here? I mean, the public health laws in Australia, as I understand it, give the government the power to close the international border and limit inbound arrival caps, because to 14-day quarantine periods, and that in itself is what's limiting the speed of it.
The federal government has power under Section 51(9) of our Constitution for quarantine. It can control the quarantine situation, but it's apparently accepting, it doesn't have to, these quotas that are insisted upon by states, and that's the bottleneck. I mean, there are hotels, plenty of hotels empty, that you simply pay the states to accept more. I think there's a facility on Manus Island, isn't there? That's probably going. There's the old quarantine station on North Head. I wouldn't mind 14 days looking at the harbour. But seriously, I think that it's quite within the Commonwealth government's power to break the logjam. I mean, these people will all be vaccinated. They'll be tested before they get on the plane, before takeoff. They'll wear masks. And when they arrive, they'll go straight into quarantine. So what's the problem? They really pose no difficulty, and it's simply a matter of will and perhaps of money to get them home.
So, Jeffrey, if Australia has breached international law as claimed in this petition, why is the complaint being lodged with the Human Rights Committee in Geneva and not in a court in Australia?
Because we are the only advanced democracy in the world that doesn't have a Bill of Rights. If we did have a Charter of Fundamental Rights, the right to return home would be there. But, of course, we don't. So no one can send a lawyer to get up in court and demand the right to return home. The only way is to show that we don't have, or these people don't have a domestic remedy, and so they can go to this international tribunal. I mean, Mr. Morrison did promise them last year that you'll all be home by Christmas. It was last said by the soldiers who went off to Gallipoli in 1914 and took 4 years. So I hope that we can do something. But there is extraordinary frustration if you read the stories, and they're in the documents of how frustrating it is. Some people are so frustrated they want to burn their Australian passports. I've had to remind them that that's an offence under the Crimes Act.
And they're going to need it if they want to come home. But if just finally then, and I think this is where we started, the complaint's being lodged with the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva, but what power does it have? Is it just a sort of a moral suasion if its finding comes down on the side of the strandedaussies.org, or is it something more?
Well, it's something more. It's a determination that Australia is breaching a covenant that it ratified. So that's a pretty powerful... Australia has generally complied, as it did in the Tasmanian case about gay crime. So it's pretty powerful. And in any event, it will act, I hope, as a wake-up call to a government that seems to be in something of a moral vacuum at the moment, but isn't as fired up as it should be about the suffering of fellow Australians.
Jeffrey Robertson, thank you very much for joining us again on Breakfast.
Thanks, Fran.
Good luck with lockdown. That's Jeffrey Robertson, human rights lawyer, representing a group of Australians called strandedaussies.org, who brought a petition to the UN Human Rights Committee in Geneva because they want to come home. And there's 36,000 of them we know, according to DFAT, that are still stranded. Some have been trying to get home for a long time. And they reckon the government is abdicating its rights to them as Australian citizens.